I felt a sense of relief as I pulled into my driveway and noticed that Brian's Mustang wasn't there. He loved that car so much that I was jealous of it sometimes. If it wasn't there, then neither was he. I hurried into the house and ran straight into our bedroom and the attached bathroom. I didn't wait to lay out any clothes, I just stripped off my skirt, blouse and bra, leaving me naked. I really didn't know where my panties were, but that was a matter for later consideration. I turned the shower on full blast and felt even more relief as the pulsating nozzles washed away all the traces of semen from my face and body. I grabbed shower gel and a bath puff and tried as hard as I could to scrub my skin raw. The outside of my body was actually the easy part. Scrubbing my soul was much harder, and would take far longer if ever. Washing away the fact that not only had it happened, but that this wasn't the first time from my face as I looked into my husband's loving eyes would be the hard one. I leaned back in the shower as the water fell on me and cried. Why did I start this? How had I let it go this far? 3 months ago I was Laura Bell, loving and faithful wife to Brian Bell for the past 11 years. We had, or have, a great family. We have a daughter named Janet, who is 10 years old. She was named after my mother, and is a very smart little girl. Timmy, our son, is the younger child, and he was named after my dad. Brian's parents were killed in an auto accident years before we met, and he didn't want the painful memories, so we named the kids after their surviving grandparents. Our house is nearly paid off, and we both have great jobs. In terms of our marriage, things really could use a little sprucing up in the bedroom, but the rest of the house is fine. It wasn't that Brian didn't try, or that he didn't turn me on anymore, but let's face it, you can't eat steak every day, made the same way every time, without wanting some chicken or fish every once in a while. But maybe that's just my excuse for what I've become. The worst part about it is that I truly love my husband and I would do anything for that man. If it came down to it, I'd lay down my own life so he could live. But then 3 months ago, Donald Zimmerman invaded my department at the accounting firm I worked at, and everything changed. Donald, or DZ as he wanted everyone to call him, was hired in as a manager. In less than 2 weeks he became an assistant director. 2 weeks later he was a full director, and would probably become the senior director very soon. Donald was a force of nature. He was like the light you couldn't stare at for too long without going blind. He wasn't classically handsome. In fact, my husband is actually better looking and in better shape. But Donald just had this way of looking at people that made women horny and men afraid. He is a predator, short and simple. If you cross his path, you get loved, one way or another. I can still remember the first time he came into my office to drop off some files for some accounts he wanted me to take over. He had recently simply fired several of our account reps to make the department more streamlined and save revenue. He was now in the process of handing out their work to other account reps to take up the slack. Bell, huh? He growled at me in that deep voice. He looked me over as if he was looking at a piece of meat. He dropped off 3 thick folders on my desk, and before I could protest about my workload, he started growling again. I'm glad that I didn't fire you, he said, walking around my desk and continuing to stare at me. Do you prefer Miss, or are you one of those Ms. girls? He asked. Actually, it's Mrs. I croaked nervously as I held up my hand and displayed my wedding ring. Too bad, he said as he started to leave. See you later. Too bad, why? I wondered as I started looking at the large pile of work he'd left me. For some reason I couldn't get his image out of my mind. His suit was wrinkled and the top of his shirt was open a couple of buttons. His tie didn't match either his shirt or his suit, and was just dangling around his neck. His shoes were scuffed and old-fashioned. He obviously didn't take much time with his personal grooming, but he probably didn't have to. His whole aura just gave off some kind of weird animal magnetism that I couldn't explain. As I thought about him just barging into my office without even knocking and then leaving with that "too bad" comment just hanging in the air, I noticed that my panties were already wet from just thinking about it. An hour later, just before lunch, my door slammed open and then closed again, before I could even register it. He rushed into the room and came around my desk, grabbing me by my shoulders and standing me up. No peaches," he said as he looked me over again. "I guess it doesn't matter though for this. What the do you think you're doing?" he growled at me. "Taste it, you whore." Then he just grabbed the back of my head and started literally loving me. While his eyes wasn't any bigger or thicker than Brian's, he was slamming it into my mouth with almost no regard for me. Several times it just forced its way down my throat and I couldn't breathe. Then mercifully he picked me up and bent me over my desk. He couldn't though, so he just cut them in half with my desk scissors. I knew it was coming. I knew what he wanted to do to me, but somehow I didn't scream out. In fact, I think I really wanted it. I was waiting for it. Brian hadn't gotten me this excited in a long time. My legs spread apart so far that I had trouble walking for the next few hours. There was no foreplay, no gentle stroking, he just rammed it in and took me. I slid down off the desk still dazed. Married, huh? He smirked at me. Why would anyone marry a whore like you? Then he left, slamming the door, as hard as he had when he came in. For the next few days I was racked with guilt. DZ came into my office whenever he felt like it, and just used me however he felt like, and left. In the back of my mind I knew what I was doing was wrong, and I knew that it would probably end in disaster, but I was powerless to do anything about it. He came in one morning and bent me over the table. He said he liked it better that way because he didn't have to look at me, and I didn't have any peach anyway. That morning he noticed that I wasn't as wet as he expected. Who have you been loving? He asked me through clenched teeth. Brian, I said in a nervous voice. Who the is Brian? He demanded. My husband. I sniveled, but I actually turned to look at him. I have no intentions of taking seconds from anybody, so you're going to have to stop loving him. That was the only time I displayed any kind of backbone. Never. I snarled back at him. Then you'll have to pay the consequences. He growled even louder. He bent me back over the desk. This is the switch I was thinking. He doesn't usually go in for foreplay of any kind. I was, of course, wrong. I wasn't a virgin there either, but no one had ever been so rough with me, and I screamed out. Shut up, you stupid bitch, he said. You really don't want anyone to find out about this, do you? Things started to go downhill from that point. With DZ being anything but subtle, it soon became known around the office that he was loving nearly half of the female staff members there. A couple of them had complained and were soon free of his advances, but I seemed to be unable to get myself free. This inability, and the fact that most of my coworkers liked my husband, made me the office whore. Several former friends of mine, who worked there, had made it known that they couldn't wait for the next company party so Brian could find out. They all agreed that Brian didn't deserve the way I was treating him, but surprisingly no one told him. People I had worked with for years no longer respected me or even spoke to me. My only solace was that my family didn't know, or so I thought. My behavior had been affected over the last month or so, and Brian had noticed, but I didn't know it at the time. True to form, he started to gently ask me what was wrong, and whether he had unknowingly done something to displease me. Of course I angrily denied it, and told him I was just overloaded with work at the office and would probably have to work more late nights. Laura, are you having an affair? He'd asked me. He'd just come straight out and asked me, face to face. The man I loved was asking me if I was having love with someone else. I did the only thing I could do. I lied my ass off. I looked into his beautiful eyes and laughed. Are you crazy? I asked him. I'd never risk what we have. I love you too much. I love our kids and our life too much. That would never happen, doofus. I told you already, I'm just loaded down at the office. You know they recently fired a lot of account reps and they divided all of the remaining work among the rest of us. I just have to get used to a new manager and a new caseload. I swear that's all it is. Then I pulled him to me and kissed him as if my life depended on it. I really believed that he'd bought it. I foolishly thought that his suspicion was over. I now know that it wasn't. In fact, that was probably when he hired his PI to get the evidence. 2 weeks later, things had come to a head without me knowing it. My son had a play at school, and I missed it. I was supposedly called to stay after work at the last minute. In reality, I was at a motel with DZ. I missed my son's first holiday play to let a married man, who didn't give a shit about me, practically raped me for an hour and a half at a cheap motel. Needless to say, when I got home that night, my family was very disappointed in me. My daughter made several sharp cracks at me, and neither my husband or my son would speak to me. The biggest dagger in my heart came when my husband got into bed and rolled away from me, and actually pushed my hands away when I tried to touch him. Brian W. As always, a man of few words, and this time he said only, "No," but his meaning was clear. The next day we had a staff meeting where DZ was in his element, going over all of the accounts, and berating the account reps that he thought mishandled them. He looked at Ira Bennington's account with Caldwell Machining. They were a company we'd handled for nearly 20 years. "Look at their bottom line. We need to get a bigger payment from them immediately," said DZ. "But we've done business with them for years," replied Ira. Their business sector is down across the country right now, but it's cyclical. They'll come back. Who cares? Snapped DZ. They may or they may not. You said it yourself. We're in business with them. We're not dating them. You need to get our money. Their business is circling the drain. They may come out of it, or they may not. We need to get what's ours, or we'll be circling that same drain soon. Circling the drain was DZ's catchphrase. He used it to describe any and all negative or neutral situations. I was really stressed out at work, and at home my husband and son barely spoke to me. Brian had actually started sleeping in the guest room. And my daughter Janet was always talking back to me or making wisecracks. My family and my marriage were circling the drain, and I needed to break DZ's hold on me before it was too late. I knew I needed to stop, but I couldn't. As I sat at the dinner table alone, Janet came into the kitchen. I asked her about her day, trying to start a conversation. Why are you asking about me? Isn't there someone else you'd rather be spending your time with? She sneered at me. My first thought was that she knew about DZ, but how? I wondered. I later realized that it was only a preteen's typical jealousy because her mom was spending so much extra time at work. But before my mind realized that, my body reacted. I had never before struck either of my children, but my hand reached back and I slapped her across the face far harder than I'd intended. Even before I could say I was sorry and it was just stress, Brian was between me and Janet. He looked at her face and hugged her, and then he looked at me. From the expression on his face, for the first time in my marriage I was afraid of my gentle husband. He calmed himself down and just said, "Straw." I didn't know what he meant by that then. He threw my car keys to me and said, "Go out for a drive and clear your head. Don't come back until you've calmed down and gotten yourself together." I'm serious, Laura. When I came back I wanted so badly to hold my baby and apologize to her, but she was already asleep, with her dad sitting by her bed. When I opened the door and stepped into the room, he simply shook his head at me, pointed to the door and nodded for me to leave. Before I left for work the next morning, Brian told me that he was going to take the kids on a vacation for a week or so, since they'd gotten out of school for Christmas anyway. He wanted to visit my parents and go to a couple of other places. A family vacation is just what we need. I said, "Do you want to wait a couple of days and I'll go as well? Or should I just join you later? Laura, right now you're going through something that you need to get over before you're ready to be with us," he said. "Maybe at this point in your life we're not what you need. You really do need to figure out what you want though, because you can't have both." And he looked me straight in the eye when he said that. "You're scheduled to work until Christmas Eve anyway. That's only a week away. Why don't you take some time to yourself and handle your problems, and we'll see what happens then. I really hope you've solved this, because you won't get another chance." For the next week, which was last week, the house was lonely as hell. I got a chance to see what my life would be like without my kids, and without my husband. I cried every night. It felt like a part of my soul had been ripped out. I had given up the people who cared for me just for the excitement of being used and humiliated by a man who could care less about me. It wasn't even good love, it was just the thrill of possibly getting caught, and the roughness and dirtiness of it. I had to break this off now before it cost me everything. At work for the past few days I've avoided DZ, like he was the plague. I began to realize that he really had no hold over me and he had as much to lose as I did. His wife could take him to the cleaners or I could report him to personnel. I left for work this morning, on Christmas Eve, knowing that my family will be home this evening. I was happy I'd missed them so much. Just after lunchtime DZ barged in. "Get out of my office," I snapped at him, finally growing a spine. "Come on, whore, this is going to be our last time anyway. I'm getting tired of you," he sneered. "I'm tired of this whole loony bin." Then he picked me up, pulled up my skirt, and just started ramming me. It hurt like hell because I wasn't the slightest bit wet, and he just didn't care. "This is the last time, seriously," I said, and I meant it. I silently endured the pain, thinking of it as penance for the past few weeks. I deserved to be hurt for what I'd done to Brian and my family. I realized that I'd always loved steak and I'd sought chicken and fish when I could have just spiced up the steak myself. I also realized that instead of complaining about my steak, I should have been glad just to have something to eat. DZ had noticed that I wasn't reacting to him slamming me at all. I just took it passively, which probably took all of the fun out of it for him. I was struck with a mixture of relief and revulsion. After this we were done. He came quicker than normal, and I wasn't ready when he just pulled it out and let his semen fly all over my face and hair. Show that to your husband. He snapped, and then started laughing. The thrill is definitely gone, babe, he said. It looks like our relationship is circling the drain. Too bad, I was thinking of taking you with me. See ya. And then he left. He didn't even close the door. A few minutes later, one of the assistant directors came into my office and handed me a slip of paper. I was called to a meeting the day after Christmas with the owner of the company. But I was going to go out of town with my family then, I said. The meeting won't take very long, probably no more than a half an hour, he said and left the room. You can go home now though, everyone is leaving early today. I looked at my clock and noticed that I had just enough time to beat Brian and the kids getting home. As I stepped out of the shower and into our bedroom, I slipped into a silk camisole that drove Brian wild. Under it I had only my tiniest panties and just put on a robe over it. For the past few weeks another man had owned my body, and taken it whenever it pleased him. My head was clear now, I was finally over him, and I intended to spend the rest of my life taking my husband whenever it pleased me, starting with tonight. As soon as the kids were asleep he was mine, he would have no choice in the matter. I sat down on the couch in the living room and noticed for the first time that the house was decorated for Christmas. Oh my God, I didn't buy them anything. How loved up was I that I hadn't even bought presents for my own family. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I noticed several big boxes under the tree with my name on them. And of course Brian had put both of our names on all of the presents for the kids. On top of my stack of presents there it was, just as if nothing had happened. Every year Brian always gave me a big fancy card that told me how much he loved me. Only I knew what it meant. It was a reminder of where we'd come from. Our first Christmas together, neither of us had a job or any money. The one thing we did have though was a dream of sharing our lives together and a bright future together. So that first Christmas Brian gave me a wonderful Christmas card with a very long handwritten note inside. In that note he'd outlined our future together, how we'd get married, buy a great house, have kids, retire, travel the world and grow old together. Finally we'd be buried side by side so we'd be together in the next life as we had in this one, no matter what. I know that some women get angry if they don't get a diamond bracelet, or some fancy present that cost a lot of money for Christmas. Some even get upset when they don't get the right diamond bracelet, or the correct fancy present. Those cards meant more to me than any present you could give me because they were Brian's way of giving me something much more valuable. In his words he was promising me his heart, his soul, his love, and his life, and they were far more precious than any hunk of crystallized minerals or trips. In fact, the only time I'd been disappointed at a Christmas with Brian was the first year that our income was at a level we considered decent. Brian had bought me a new car and a diamond necklace. My parents and all of my relatives kept telling me how lucky I was. I think it was my mom who noticed it first. She was asking me why I kept looking around under the tree. Finally, when the kids were off playing with their toys and there was only Brian and I left, he asked me what was wrong. Besides my mom, only he had noticed that something wasn't quite right with me. "Don't you love me anymore?" I asked, brushing back my tears. "Of course," he'd said, wrapping his arms around me. "I love you more than ever." "Then where's my card?" I sniffled. Since then Brian has never forgotten, and I guess it's silly of me, but I look forward to those letters inside the cards more than anything else. Brian tells me he loves me several times every day. Well, he did up until this trouble started. But seeing the words and his feelings written down is just so powerful, so permanent. Unlike when someone tells you something, and then goes back and says, "I didn't say that," or "That's not what I meant." Seeing the words on the paper gives them more power. It may be particular to me, but I also prefer it when they're handwritten and not just printed out of some stupid computer. Anyway, there it was on top of one of my boxes, my card. I was tempted to just go ahead and read it now, but I wanted to wait and enjoy it while everyone else was opening their presents. The thing that hurt me the most, though, was that during my recent lapse in judgment, besides his normal responsibilities at his job and at home, Brian had been doing a lot of the things that I was supposed to do. He had gone far beyond the call of duty trying to hold our family together. Our kids were not old enough to have any money, so they couldn't buy him anything, and I was just pathetic. I hadn't bought presents for my parents, my kids, or my husband. So as good as Brian had been this year, there were no presents under the tree for him. I felt awful about it. Especially since, despite our recent problems, that card sat there, staring at me. It made me feel even more guilty because I had neglected him, cheated on him, hurt our kids emotionally and physically. Yet there it was, the token of his undying love for his cheating whore of a wife. I started crying and just fell asleep. When I woke up, it was Christmas Day, and the house still felt empty. Where the hell were they? Maybe something had happened. I jumped up and ran to the phone to check the messages. There were only 3 messages in our voicemail. The most recent one was from someone in our HR department at work reminding me of the meeting tomorrow. The second message was from Brian. He said that they'd be delayed and I should go ahead and open my presents. The third was obviously a crank call, some man screaming and cursing at me. I didn't even listen to that one all the way through. I just put the phone down and sat back on the couch watching the slow ticking of the second hand around the face of the clock. The card sat on top of my presents, and I was dying to open it. I made a cup of coffee and started trying to figure this out. They had been gone for a week, but they'd somehow come into the house and decorated it while I was at work yesterday. If they decorated the house, they had to be back in town. Brian loved my parents and my parents loved him. They had probably gone over to visit my parents and either stayed the night or had car trouble and would be home today. Temptation finally got the better of me and I decided to go ahead and open the card and read my letter. I wouldn't look at the card itself, I would only read a little bit of the letter. Then I'd save the rest for later when they were home. I picked up the large envelope. It was wrapped in a festive Christmas ribbon, but it wasn't actually sealed. That would make closing it back up easier. Laura, the letter began. That was unusual. Brian usually wrote, "My dearest Laura," or some affectionate nickname. I know that these letters have come to mean a lot to you over the years. Far more so than the presents or any other aspect of the holidays, so I'm using this letter as always to tell you of my feelings. Before you read the rest of this letter, please do me a favor and open the box that was under the letter. I opened the box and inside there was a folder and a DVD. I put the disc into the DVD player and watched for as long as I could. A date stamp on top of the screen showed 2 weeks ago, Tuesday. I remembered it because that was the day that I'd missed Timmy's play. It showed me going into the motel where I'd met DZ. Then the camera zoomed in on the date and the time. There was also footage, and really disgusting footage of DZ using me. Then thankfully it ended. When it started up again, there was my little boy, my baby, looking into the camera, and all he said was, "Mommy didn't come to my play." I started crying. The next section was obviously shot from inside my office. There was no date, but it was far worse. DZ simply came into my office, snatched me out of my chair, bent me over the desk, loved me, and left. There was no resistance from me, just a dumb blank smile that in itself was more damning than anything else. The video next showed the hallway outside of my office where several of my former friends were gathered. You could hear them talking about what a whore I was. Then DZ stepped out of the office and smiled at them. I wasn't stupid and I could see what this tape was designed to be used for. There were more scenes, some of them were far worse. Especially the one where DZ loved me on the big table in the boardroom. I fast-forwarded through them all to the end. I was nearly hysterical as I picked up the letter and began to read it again. My hands were shaking so badly that I could hardly make out the words. Now that you know that I know, it makes this easier. I've had plenty of time to go over this in my head and figure out what my options are. I could have pretended not to know and hoped that you still loved us and would eventually come back to us. I spent a lot of time on the internet recently and read a lot of stories about men who were strong enough to do that. Unfortunately, I'm not. There were also stories there about men who were aroused at the idea of their wives loving someone else. Those really disgusted me because they're obviously the product of twisted individuals, and I pray for them. How could you love someone and want to see them loving someone else? Anyway, I couldn't even watch the video of you with that guy because it just hurt too badly. That gave me another option: confront you about it and beat the shit out of him or kill him. This letter is me confronting you about your problem. And it is your problem, not ours. Neither I or our kids did anything to drive you away from us. You did this all on your own, so you'll have to fix it on your own. As to the second part, if I killed your lover, I'd end up in jail, and I can't do that because I have 2 kids who need their father, especially since they've lost their mother. The bit of revenge I'm getting on him as we speak will have to suffice for now. That only leaves me the question of us. Laura, as you know, I have loved you since the first day we met. And I've always told you that we'd be together no matter what. Shakespeare said, "Thus conscience doth make fools of us all." I understand fully what that means right now because I cannot be true to myself and my own conscience and have anything further to do with you. But at the same time, I told you we'd always be married. So I'm not going to divorce you, But you need to understand that I can't ever live with you again, and don't want to ever see you again. If you push this or try to find me in any way, I'll know it and I will file for divorce. When the videos in this folder come out, and they will as soon as I hear that you've tried to find me. It will ruin your life and any hopes of moving on in whatever career you have left. The letter then told me to open the next box. Inside there was another DVD. I put this one in the player and turned it on. This was the part that really sent me over the edge. The three of them were there together. It looked like it was done in one of those places you go to for family portraits. Brian looked so handsome and yet so sad, I didn't know whether to go and hug him or try and screw him. Timmy was also looking sad. Only Janet was smiling as she looked into the camera. "Mommy, I'm sorry you don't love us anymore," said Timmy. My heart clutched in my chest as if it would stop beating. "We want you to be happy, so we're gonna go far away. We'll miss you." Brian started to say something to the camera and couldn't. My big strong husband was crying over something I'd done. It was just too much for me. He just couldn't manage to get it together enough to say goodbye to me, so he turned to Janet. Janet just smiled and stared right into the camera, and said simply, "Bye," and then threw in, "Bitch." "Janet, that was unnecessary," was all I heard Brian say, and then the screen went blank. In times like these the little things stick out. The thought that kept going through my mind was, if it was so unnecessary, why'd you leave it in? Why let the last words I'd hear from my daughter for a very long time be her calling me a bitch? I know I deserved it, but to actually leave it that way was beyond cruel. I just sat there and cried and stared at the walls for a while. Then I picked up the letter and tried to finish it. "Laura, I didn't enter what I'm going to do rashly. I gave you every opportunity to either come clean or stop what you're doing. Both before and after you slapped my daughter, I practically begged you to stop. I was fully willing to take you back, no questions asked, because I believed that the kids needed you in their lives, even though I could never have trusted you again. Hitting my child was the straw that broke the camel's back. Until then our marriage was in trouble. That day only exacerbated it. I was still willing to give you another chance though, because once again, I loved you so much." My mind grabbed at that sentence. I have one more chance. I have to be the best wife and mother I can, because they're only giving me one chance. I continued reading. The letter continued. "But even today, Christmas Eve, the day we were supposed to come back to you and start over," you continued. "While the kids hung a few ornaments on the tree, I checked my video feeds one last time, and there he was coming into your office this morning to claim what should have been mine alone. God damn it, Brian, I thought. It is all yours. This was only a stupid fling, just one tiny meaningless bump in the long road of our life." I looked at the letter again and read. "I had already made my plans and I had some help with them from your dad, so all I had to do was leave, since you weren't willing to give him up. Your lifestyle is obviously more important to you than I am, and also more important than our kids, so we've left to start a new life somewhere else. Since these letters are so important to you, every Christmas I'll send one to you from wherever we are, through your parents in case you move. I'll make sure to include a picture of the kids so you can see them as they grow. And when they're old enough to make their own decisions, I'll let them decide whether or not to come and see you. I wish you all the best, and hope that you can find the happiness you need, and though it breaks my heart, I'm giving you the freedom to find it. I'm sorry if we were in your way. We always loved you." And it was signed, "Until next Christmas, Brian." I sat there in shock. This couldn't be true. I got up and went upstairs. All of Brian's clothes were gone from his closet. All the kids' clothes were gone as well. Their favorite toys and games, all gone. They had taken everything except the furniture. I suddenly had a thought. My dad could probably help me. He had a lot of ties to the government from his former job, and he might be able to put me in touch with someone who could help me track them down. I didn't care what it did to my name or my reputation, I just wanted my family back. There was no way I could last until next Christmas to hear from them. Brian was the only man I wanted. Why didn't he know that? I didn't bother putting on any clothes. I just ran out of the house and got into my car. I broke several traffic laws getting to my parents' house. I knocked on the door and saw a head in the window at the top of the door. It was my dad. I waited for him to open the door. After a few minutes had passed, the door still didn't open, and I was sure he had seen me. I started knocking at the door again. Finally, my mom opened the door and asked me what I wanted. I noticed that she hadn't opened the door all the way and also had not invited me in. "Mom, I need Dad's help with something," I said, trying to hold back my tears. Do not let that whore into my house. I heard my father bellowing from inside. Then it hit me, the voice from the phone message, the one I thought was a crank caller, had been my dad. Laura, you need to give your father some time to calm down. My mother whispered to me. Mom, there isn't any time for him to calm down. I've got to find Brian. I screamed. My dad stepped up to the doorway and pulled the door open. I can't help you find them, and even if I could, I wouldn't. He screamed at me. But Dad, you know people. I said. And it's the people I know who provided him with their new IDs so he can start his life all over again. I even paid for it. I don't even know what state they're living in, but if I did, I wouldn't tell you. He's promised to bring them for visits in a neutral area whenever I want. And send lots of pictures. Laura, I know you're my daughter, but you've cost me my grandkids because you couldn't keep your legs closed. And Brian, that poor man thought the sun rose and set just on you. And you really loved him over. You had it all, nice house, great kids, and a man who really loved you. I hope it was worth it. If your mother ever tried that with me, I'd have put her in the ground. But he just kept waiting for you to get your head out of your ass and close your legs. When I saw that video, I wanted nothing else to do with you. I just kept wondering what happened to the woman I raised. Are you on drugs, maybe some kind of slut-making steroids? My dad just stared at me as he said this and then just turned away. My mother didn't know what to say to me either. She just waved goodbye and closed the door. I spent the rest of that day crying in my bed. The next day I was in no mood or shape to go to the meeting at work. When I was 30 minutes late, they called me. The meeting had been set up to formally notify me that I had been terminated, and that the company was suing me. Brian had sued them for failing to enforce the morals clause in my employment contract. The video had been very damning since it clearly showed that many who worked there knew about DZ and me. They had also fired DZ. That was what he meant by taking me with him. Brian was also suing DZ, and DZ's wife was divorcing him as well. The company had settled out of court with Brian for several $1 million, and was trying to recoup at least some of its losses by suing DZ and myself. Circling the drain. That expression DZ used to describe everything. Ever since I'd met DZ, my life had been circling the drain, and now Brian had just flushed the toilet.